It's in Upper Egypt. This is very important because so many incredible people from ancient Egypt come from this location. But not only that, so many people from the Middle Ages of Egypt and the Golden Age of Islam came from this very location. In the Golden Age of Islam, a lot of the people who came from this location happened to be Nubian. The assumption then made is that most people who came from this location in the past would have been Nubian. But here's the weird thing: people like Queen Tai, Tutankhamun, and all these other people, their ancestors descend from Akhmim. Possibly they could have been Nubian for that reason alone. But if we ignore this for 1 second and think about the most important person to come out of that region, it has to be Zulnun al Misri. Not because of what he said about Islam, which he profoundly changed it, introducing some very important steps into Sufism, but more than that was his works on deciphering the ancient Egyptian language, being so knowledgeable about the language himself. His last name, Al Misri, means the Egyptian. And of course, you would expect someone with that name to have done some of the most important research in the job. Before we go too deep with anything about these people, let us look at their faces and see these scars and the way they're made with these double scars and triple scars, which, by the way, have a very deep significance and a deep meaning. And they go far and wide into the continent, and to be found in this place of Egypt, we can easily assume, because we find other Nubian type scarred things from ancient Egypt, we can easily assume that a lot of people who must have come from Upper Egypt or Meme would have had these scars on their faces as well. But why are people who are being found in Egypt having the same scars that you would find in, let's give one example, West Africa? This did give away to show the similarities between these several cultures that were separated at birth, shows you that there is a significantly large and an important part of scarification. Remember, this is scarification of women, and those scars are not light. That is not tattooing. That would hurt. Take a knife, just a small one, and touch the end of it. And I mean one that is sharp, touch the end of it. And now imagine someone doing that to your face, which, by the way, most of these were not done with knives. They were done with like thorns. So this is not a small thing. This is huge. And you can see at the ends of a lot of sticks, or a lot of, I forgot what they call those, shillelaghs. They have these images, these faces that show scarification from the Kingdom of Congo. So we know that the Bantus just did this all over, but I know from seeing it with my own eyes that people in Southern Africa do this too. I've seen it especially with Zulu people. While this has some religious significance or some religious meaning, more than that, it was also used as a medicine. I'm sure you've heard of the word bad blood. Well, this comes from the African tradition of cutting, where you cut the skin in order to let the bad blood out. This was first seen in Egypt a long time ago, but when people got to all kinds of places in Africa, they realized that people, a way that they used to treat something was to cut their skin to let out the so-called bad blood. A second way was to throw up, right, emetics, and then they, get rid of the phlegm. Another one was to basically get any of the bad fluids out of your body These would be called by a specific name in Europe, which we don't need to go into. I've told this several times. But this is why they share this. And this is why I believe that the ancient Egyptians, we can see that some of them definitely did do it. But this is why I believe that the ancient Egyptians did this anyway, because it's part of their medical system. Some of these things I have to repeat because of what other people have said. So let's first read this. Egyptians were among the first to perform bloodletting more than 3,000 years ago. From there, the practice spread to the Greeks, the Romans, then Asia and beyond. By the Middle Ages, bloodletting was widely practiced in Europe, and barbers served as pseudo medical providers. Now, that's fine. But the context I want to put in here is that I've shown you that Egypt is thought to have interacted with the rest of Africa, whatever what they call sub-Saharan Africa, very little, and that even places like East Africa or Nubia interacted with the rest of Africa very little. And so the question is, given that some of the earliest people to encounter sub-Saharan Africans speak of bloodletting, speak of, let's just go with bloodletting. Where did they get it from? If they didn't get it from the Egyptians, where did they get it from? Now, I showed you last time the medical practice of, the one where they seal the female genitals, and other Africans do that too. Circumcision, male circumcision, other Africans do that too. Like almost all the medical practices, or the, let's say, what they would consider preventative medical practices done by the ancient Egyptians are done in Africa, even though the Africans almost hold nothing else that is similar to the Egyptians. Their medical practices are the same. Now, obviously, this has to do with the fact that they stem from the exact same location, somewhere in Central Eastern Africa, and spread throughout. So this practice must be very, very, very old for it to have remained at least within these Africans until, I mean, honestly, people still do it today, still do bloodletting today in Africa. Now that we've got that background about the type of people that the Nubians that lived in Egypt were, let's go into Zulnun. So the Egyptian and Nubian Muslim Zulnun traveled as an ascetic in Arabia, Palestine, and Syria. Different aspects of his career are reflected in the sources, a factor which has caused some uncertainty. Different dates are also supplied at some stage. Presumably, when he was still young, Zulnun moved to Al Fustat, situated near the Nile Delta, far to the north of Akhmim. This geographical demarcator is associated with two different roles: a Hermetic alchemist at Akhmim and a Sufi Gnostic at Fustat. Zulnun twice became a heretic, the dates being variously given. One version states that he was arrested on a charge of heresy in 829 CE. This is too early for other assessments. Following the accession of the Abbasid Caliph al-Wathig, that monarch gave the order for a qazi in Egypt to impose stern restriction upon all descendants from the official Abbasid doctrine concerning the Quran. Many scholars in Egypt were imprisoned or fled into hiding, wishing to avoid flogging or execution. Zulnun himself fled from the persecution. However, he returned afterwards, being now willing to acknowledge official dogma. The compromising report is not found in any of the orthodox Sufi sources, which dominate the traditional history of Sufism.
Immediately realize that there was a connection between the Coptic spoken in their days and the ancient Egyptian language, thus calling the ancient Egyptian one Al-Qibtiyya Al-Ula, the first Coptic, and calling the Coptic of the days Al-Qibtiyya Al-Thaniya. And this is in fact the greatest breakthrough that here in the West they used to help them unlock the secrets of hieroglyphic. A famous scholar called Kircher in the 17th century wrote the first Coptic grammar, and it opened the eyes of the Western scholars to the value of studying Coptic in order to understand ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic. How did Kircher, by the way, come to this conclusion? He studied about 40 different Arabic manuscripts. Is somebody you'll never believe, Jabir ibn Hayyan. We all know him as a great alchemist, whose theories were, named after him, etc., etc. And from early 8th century, Jabir ibn Hayyan wrote a good book called Hal al-Rumuz wa Mafatih al-Kunuz. Well, as it happened, most of the alchemists I came across who deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphic are also called Sufi. So they are the two things together. Zunnun al-Misri was a famous Sufi and as well an alchemist. The famous Ibn Wahshiyya is called al-Sufi as well, even though he's primarily an alchemist. All of them. Now, the first major breakthrough, other than the book of Jabir ibn Hayyan, came at the hands of Zunnun al-Misri, who in the middle of the 9th century was famous in Egypt. He was born in Akhmim, that city in Upper Egypt, brought up there, probably from Sudanese descent, and he spent all his life inside the temple learning the language of the walls of the temple, i.e. hieroglyphic. He must have found a way of linking this because he was fluent in Coptic. He was good at Coptic, that means he was able to read Greek, if not fluent in Greek as well. If you are fluent in Coptic and the Greek in the 9th century, and you live inside an Egyptian temple, and you are fortunate enough to have somebody around you from the Coptic priesthood community, the Rohban, you would be very lucky. You'll be in the right place at the right time, because that is one little step to learning this ancient Egyptian wisdom, not necessarily through the hieroglyphic, but remember, a great deal of ancient Egyptian material were translated into Coptic and into Greek. Now, I have a feeling that Zunnun is the bridge between the ancient Egyptian Sufi tradition and the Islamic Sufi tradition. As you all know him, he's credited that he brought to Islam something that never existed in it before. How did Zunnun al-Misri come across this? This is the very same science. I, as an Egyptologist, and every Egyptologist here, and one of my excellent friends, Professor Stephen Quirk, sitting there, we all agree that we studied ancient Egyptian texts, unfortunately, for their philological value. If we studied them for its spiritual and religious value, we may have reached this conclusion. The few texts I studied led me to believe that Zunnun al-Misri came across this science, or the seeds of it at least, through his knowledge of ancient Egyptian religious text. So Zunnun al-Misri is really the key link between ancient Egypt and Islamic Sufism. But in my case, I'm more interested in him because of his famous book, which Al-Furqan referred to first. And this book is in this one here. This is in Turkey, in Kemal Ataturk Library. And when I found this reference in Al-Furqan, famous encyclopedia on the survey of the manuscript in the Islamic world, I was intrigued. I said, this is very weird. I've never come across in reference to a book like this on Zunnun al-Misri. Look at the title. The title is quite remarkable. The title, most of the titles, of course, are very romantic of these. And it talks about the uncovering, al-Kashf al-Rumuz, uncovering of the signs of the ancient scripts. And you feel, why would a Sufi like Zunnun be interested in uncovering and deciphering ancient scripts? Anyway, I sent to the library and they kindly sent me a copy of the whole book. And this is some of the book. Gives the first one, Qalam Jabir ibn Hayyan fi ilm al-Sana, a pen of Jabir ibn Hayyan in alchemy. Alchemy is called in Arabic al-Sana or al-Sana al-Karima, the noble art or craft. Now, any Egyptologist here can recognize in both the top and the lower one so many of the demotic letters. So obviously, this is not Jabir's work. This was credited to him in recognition of his contribution to the field, so they named these demotic letters after him. Now, from the same book of Zunnun to the left is his work on Coptic. Now, as I said earlier, he must have known Coptic very well, and he realized also its relationship to ancient Egyptian. So to his left, his own Coptic. He gives the shape of the letters, and he gives the phonetic value of the letters. Compare this to the right from one of our modern books. The arrangement is correct. The phonetic value is correct. It's a fantastic work.
These are the Phoenician letters. They were extinct by the time of Zulnun and most of the Arabs, but you can see there that you can still see their similarities. So starting from the side, this side, you can see that A is sideways, that's A. That thing that looks like 9 is B. The finger is Gimel, that would be C. The triangle is D. You see with delta, you've seen that in Greek. The E that's facing the other side is E, and I think it also became F. And then it goes on and on and on. Another one that's very notable is this M looking thing, this thing that looks like a W, but it's like curved. That's M. And a lot of these eventually would become the letters that we associate today with the English letters. But you can see them that they look very much alike the normal letters that we have today. But this was just one part of what he added into the religion and took from back in the day, the stages of rising in Sufism. He took that from the ancient Egyptians. He took a lot of their mysticism. I mean, he was a alchemist, and he did all of these other ritualistic things. He probably knew more than he let on about the ancient Egyptians. Not to mention that his name, Al Misri, means the Egyptian, and that had to do with some deeper thing. There was someone called Al Iraqi, and he married a local woman, and he became Al Misri as well. But it's hard to find him because they usually give him his name when he was without a wife, which, by the way, he's one of the proofs that I use that back in the day, a lot of people who came from Arabia would convert and become Egyptian, so they'll get the last name Al Misri after they've moved into Egypt, and that's only one of them. There's some who would move from Al Abbas, so they'd move from Spain and then move into Africa, and then names would change into these African places. Conventional Sufi sources tend to depict Dhul-Nun as a pious Muslim and a Sufi Gnostic. A complement is afforded by the report of the history Masudi, the Herodotus of the Arabs. Born in Baghdad, Masudi traveled for many years before settling in Egypt at Fustat. His extensive Muja el-Dahab provides the first extant semi-historical account of Dhul-Nun, deriving information from inhabitants of Akhmim during a visit made by the historian to the township. Masudi wrote, Dhul-Nun al-Misri Akhmimi, the eccentric, was a philosopher who pursued a course of his own in religion. He was one of those who elucidate the history of these temple ruins. Barabi, he roamed among them and examined a great quantity of figures and inscriptions. Masudi offered a version of some inscriptions which Dhul-Nun claimed to have deciphered. This report confirms the early fame of the subject as a hieroglyphicist. Modern scholars are inclined to be incredulous of the 9th century archaeology. Dhul-Nun is said to have discovered a book in the temple of Akhmim. Masudi quotes two saying and a poem allegedly derived from this book. Dr. Epstein has pointed out the lack of any mystical and alchemical meaning in these quotations. their attributions to Dilnun seems to be spurious in other sources. These two sayings and the aforementioned poem are ascribed to figures other than Dilnun. The same analyst concludes that the Masudi lore seems to have originated in Egyptian alchemical circles active in the first half of the 10th century, which may mean 2 generations after Dilmun. Again, I don't want to give you the impression that he was the only black scholar in Egypt. There was a lot of them, and there was a lot of them who were called Misri, and there was a lot of them who were called with the Nubian name, and then there were others that were called with Zanj and other stuff like that. Now, why in Egypt would this happen? And again, I've said it before, in the golden age of Islam, this was the typical thing that was happening. But let's go somewhere south of the golden age of Islam because, okay, so this was happening, everybody was liking what was happening in this region of the world, but this region of the world was curious about other parts of the world, like they mentioned Zanj regions. This map depicts the Indian Ocean trade routes that might have made the Indonesians move from Indonesia into Madagascar, but they don't fully explain why the Bantu people moved into Madagascar. Now, we know that these Indian Ocean routes would have been opened at least by the 8th century because the Arabs were already there by the 8th century. But if we go back just a little, so if we look at Mozambique, about the 3rd century AD, this is 300 years after allegedly Jesus died, 300 years after he died, we find some porcelain from the Persian Empire in Mozambique. This is pretty far down. In the 6th century, we find even more, a lot there, in a place called Bazaruto Island. Now, this wouldn't be shocking if we didn't know the maps that were being built back then. And the maps by Al Idrisi, one of the map makers, the supreme map makers of the time, who included every famous city known to man, he only ended at the Horn of Africa. He didn't go lower than that. And maybe even Kilwa is in there, but he didn't go any further down than that. But we know that Persian porcelain made it all the way down to Mozambique. So, what's going on here? Well, the answer is in two parts. One, people from the Horn of Africa are probably bringing in stuff down, but we know that there were ships leaving the shores of a place called Chibwene. Chibwene is a location in Mozambique that was connecting two places inside Africa that existed a little later than they did. It connected a place called Manyigeni and Great Zimbabwe, but it was there prior to. And this place from 600 AD traded with Arabs, Indians. In fact, I forgot where to find it now, but there is some attesting to Indian books that talk about them moving through the Indian Ocean southwards and then trading there. But what would they trade? What did they possibly have? Well, there's a bunch of stuff that they had, but we know what they got. First, let's talk about what they got. They got glass and some other unglazed pottery and stuff like that. And of course, the porcelain. So if you imagine 600 AD, right? Imagine your head. That's when like the Islamic Empire is starting. That's when the Romans and all these other people are kind of at their lost leg.